Hi everyone, and welcome on another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. I just need to be careful getting out of here because I'm completely surrounded by motorbikes. I'm leaving the south entrance of Yellowstone, which is behind us, and today's virtual Yellowstone tour covers the stretch of road between Yellowstone South Entrance and West Thumb Geyser Basin. That over there, the Snake River picnic area, is my favorite picnic area in all of Yellowstone National Park. Those of you who've watched a few of these will know that I strongly believe that in order to have a great picnic area up here in Yellowstone, you must have a river. And there, of course, you have the Snake River, and you have open meadows, you have mountains in the background, you have forests. And this over here I always feel to be really dangerous. I like to go biking and mountain biking in the area, but look how narrow that little stretch of path is on the side of the road where bikers can go. And there's so much that is interesting in Yellowstone that people's attention is always being diverted from the road. And I think you're taking your life in your hands. Talking about taking your life in your hands, what's up with that guy overtaking? I think you're taking your life in your hands when you ride a bicycle through Yellowstone National Park. Let's take a look on a map to see exactly where we are at the moment. If you go to the following of our sites, yellowstonetours.net/map, that's yellowstonetours.net/map, you can see a map of the park, and I will drop a copy of the relevant section in over here. I'll get back to the map in a moment. There's two really nice waterfalls on this road, just on the other side of Crawfish Creek, which is the little river that this bridge goes over. On the right hand side there, you'll see a pullout where you can park and go to Moose Falls. Moose Falls is a pretty little waterfall, and it's not anywhere near as busy as the next waterfall that we're going to come across, called Lewis Falls is, because it's set back from the road, but it's an easy 4 or 5 minute stroll, although the ground is not paved and you'll be on dirt and gravel and rocks as you make your way down to Moose Falls. Still, I feel that it is worth going there to take a video or take a picture. To get back to the map at yellowstonetours.net/map, you will notice that at the very bottom of the map, at the very south section of the map, you will see the entrance to Yellowstone. In order to get to Yellowstone from the south, you'll generally come up through the town of Jackson, through Jackson Hole, and if you've ever wondered what the difference is between Jackson and Jackson Hole, well, in the old days, the old-timers called a hole a high elevation valley. So any valley that was located at altitude was a hole. Jackson, Wyoming is located at altitude. There's a beautiful valley all around it, surrounded by the mountains, particularly the Grand Teton Mountains, so that area is Jackson Hole. So you'll come up from Jackson through Jackson Hole into Grand Teton National Park, and from Grand Teton National Park over a 6-mile stretch of road called the Rockefeller Parkway, and then you'll come to Yellowstone's south entrance. And that is where I have just left, and we're making our way up to West Thumb. If you have a look at the map again, you'll see that the roads through Yellowstone make up a massive figure of 8. Our tour company and many others like to divide our tours of Yellowstone into a tour of the lower loop of the figure of 8 and a tour of the upper loop of the figure of 8. And if you have a look at the lower loop, you'll see a soft purple line that runs around more or less following the lower loop. And that's where the Caldera is or was. That's the gigantic hole in the ground that was left behind when the Yellowstone supervolcano last erupted about 625,000 years ago. And if you look at the southern edge of the caldera, Excuse me, I'm just waiting for these people to overtake. If you look at the southern edge of the Caldera, you'll see that it passes through a place called Yellowstone Lake. Lewis Lake. And we are to the south of Lewis Lake, so this is one of the reasons that we're not going to see any thermal features, any geysers, any hot springs, any mud pots or fumaroles in the area that we're driving through at the moment. There is some beautiful scenery, rivers, mountains, the forests that you can see, but the thermal features we'll see a little further to the north, particularly when we get to West Thumb Geyser Basin, and I'll tell you more about West Thumb Geyser Basin when we get closer. So this road then runs from the south entrance up to West Thumb, and we're more or less following to our east on the other side of those trees the Lewis River, and we'll see the Lewis River as it flows through Lewis Canyon shortly. In fact, you can see a sign there that says Lewis River Canyon. I will pull out so we can get a video of Lewis River and Lewis Canyon, and I'll drop it into this video. But as you might guess, the Lewis River and Lewis Falls and Lewis Canyon and Lewis Lake are named after Captain Meriwether Lewis from Lewis and Clark fame. The great irony, though, is, to the best of our knowledge, Meriwether Lewis actually didn't make it down to Yellowstone National Park. His partner, Captain William Clark, came down the Yellowstone River, as I'll tell you more about, but didn't get to see Yellowstone's real thermal features. So I've often wondered why this stretch of water was named after Captain Meriwether Lewis, but so be it. The Lewis River is entirely within Yellowstone National Park. It starts at the south end of Shoshone Lake and flows for 3 miles into Lewis Lake. In fact, that is the only stretch of the Lewis River that you're allowed to go boating on. And this over here is one of the pullouts that you can stop at to see the Lewis River and Lewis Canyon, but it's not the one that I recommend. If you're driving up, or for that matter down south or north on this stretch of road, the pullout that I suggest that you take is one that has one of those notices, one of those signs up that the Park Service puts up telling you about what you're seeing in the area. And one of these pullouts does, it's very informative. It actually talks or tells you about how the Great Fire of 1988 jumped over the Lewis River, which I will tell you a little bit more about. But I was saying that the Lewis River falls entirely within Yellowstone National Park, and the 3-mile section between Shoshone Lake and Lewis Lake is the only part of the river that you're allowed to go boating on. There's not that many of Yellowstone's waters where you are allowed to go boating, but that is one of them. Anyway, the river then comes out of Lewis Lake and makes its way over Lewis Falls, which is a very pretty waterfall, which we're going to come across a little further down this road, and then it makes its way through Lewis Canyon, and the Lewis River eventually flows into the Snake River, not too far from Yellowstone's south entrance, and it actually alters the direction of the Snake River a bit as it flows in a more southerly direction, and then past that picnic spot that I mentioned to you. Boy, this guy is going really slowly. I'm going to pull over for a moment to let him get ahead. Well, hopefully that guy has pulled sufficiently far ahead of us. I hope you can see the Lewis River below as it makes its way down through Lewis Canyon. And this over here, where you see that notice, where you see that sign, is the pullout that I always recommend that you stop at. There are some wonderful views of the river down below as well as the canyon. The sign that I mentioned, there's a little waterfall, a little more like a cascade. The sign that I mentioned talks about how the Great Fire of 1988, which was on the east side of the river, over in that direction over there, how it was able to jump over this entire canyon. At the time, the firefighting authorities in the park back in '88 were hoping that the Lewis River and Lewis Canyon may act as something of a fire block for the river, for the fire, but they had no chance. There's a little bit of a hill on the other side of the river, and as the winds drove the fire up and over that hill, so it's some what they call firebrands jumped the river very easily and burnt the other side of the river as well, not in this area where we are now, but in the part behind us where that notice is. I started to tell you about the Great Fire of 1988 and how it came along on that side of the river. This explains it a lot better than I can. But basically what happened, there was a hope that the river here in the canyon would act as a fire break. But the winds were so strong and the fire was so powerful that the winds drove the fire, and it actually leapt right over this canyon and came onto the other side and started burning it over there as well. But this is one of my favorite places to stop in this part of Yellowstone. Please be very careful if you come down here and don't get anywhere near the edge. The drop-offs are really precipitous. Stay well away from the edge. Continuing up this road, we're not, as I mentioned before, going to come across any major thermal features, but Lewis Falls is a very pretty waterfall, as you'll see when we get closer to it. It, as I believe I mentioned before, is right next to the road, and there's little paths on both sides of the river where you can, on the one side, just walk along the banks a bit and get a better shot of the Lewis River, and on the other side you can actually take a trail and get a lot closer to Lewis Falls itself. I started telling you, I touched on how Captain Meriwether Lewis himself didn't actually make it down to Yellowstone National Park. His partner in leading the Lewis and Clark expedition was William Clark. On their way west, on their way exploring the Missouri River and then on towards Oregon, they didn't have time or the inclination to come down to the Yellowstone area. But on the way back, I think it was in 1806, the two decided to split up for a little over a month, and it was Captain William Clark who put some boats on the Yellowstone River. He had with him 14 of his men, as well as Sacagawea, the legendary Native American woman, and her family, and they made their way down the Yellowstone River. Sacagawea suggested, before they got on the river, that they take a pass that we now know as Bozeman Pass, which is the pass between Bozeman, Montana, which is a small city in southwest Montana, and a little town called Livingston, which is an even smaller area. And she suggested that they take Bozeman Pass, and they came out about 40 miles to the north of Mammoth Hot Springs. That's the Lewis River again. They came out 40 miles to the north of Mammoth Hot Springs, and it's a little ironic that these two great explorers, particularly William Clark in this instance, didn't know how close they were to Yellowstone's thermal wonders. But they did make their way down the Yellowstone River. One of Lewis and Clark's men, John Coulter, became the first of what we now know as the Mountain Men. And I will get back to that in a minute. We are approaching the Lewis Falls area, and you'll see that there's places that you can pull off both on this side and the other side of the falls, and I'm going to drop in a video of Lewis Falls over here. It really is a pretty little waterfall, and it's so close to the road, so that's why you get so many people stopping to take a look at it. But even having said that, this time of the year is really exceptional. There's just so many people here towards the end of July. I was telling you about John Coulter, who was probably the first of what's known as the Mountain Men. These were incredibly tough guys who set out across the area around Yellowstone by themselves, often in really, really brutal winters. The temperatures here get down to minus 45, occasionally down to minus 50. And John Coulter was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and on the way back he asked for and received permission to depart the mission, and he ended up coming down this way into Yellowstone National Park and then into Grand Teton National Park, where he hooked up with some of the fur trappers. Trapping beavers for their fur was big business in those days. It's possible that Coulter came through the Yellowstone area in 1807 and or 1808. No one knows for sure, because Coulter didn't keep a thorough diary. He didn't keep a map, didn't draw a map of where he was going the way that Lewis and Clark did, and particularly William Clark in this area. The maps that William Clark drew up when he went down the Yellowstone River exploring southwest Montana were the basis for people's navigation around this area for the next 50 years or so, until there were more scientific expeditions at the end of the 1860s, beginning of the 1870s, the Washburn expedition, the Durand expedition, and then particularly the Hayden expedition, as a result of which Yellowstone was proclaimed a national park in 1872. But it's believed that John Coulter came through this area, and there's some lovely views of Yellowstone Lake off to our left or off to the west. It really is gorgeous to come here in the spring. If you consider the road between Old Faithful and West Thumb, and we're heading north towards West Thumb at the moment, but that road is one of the last roads in Yellowstone to open. And I'll shut the window so you can hear me a little better. Most of Yellowstone's roads close in the winter months. I say most. The north entrance has a road that is always open towards Mammoth Hot Springs, which is the park's headquarters. So because that's the park's headquarters, that road stays open on a year-round basis. Then outside Yellowstone's northeast entrance, just outside the northeast entrance, there's two tiny, and when I say tiny, I mean tiny communities called Silvergate and Cook City. In the summer months, they can take what's called the Beartooth Highway and head up to a place called Red Lodge, or turn right or south and go down towards Cody, and they can get their supplies or see a doctor or whatever it is that they need to do there. But in the winter months, we get so much snow here. I mean, we're talking snow in yards rather than feet. And there's so much snow that the Beartooth Highway closes down during the winter months. So in order for those people who live in Cook City and Silvergate to be able to get out and do their shopping and whatever else they need to do, there has to be a road open for them. So the road between the northeast entrance, where Cook City and Silvergate are, to Tower Junction is open, and then the road from Tower Junction heading more or less west, a little bit to the north, up towards Mammoth Hot Springs is open, and then, as I mentioned before, the road from Mammoth Hot Springs towards Gardner, Montana is open. Now, most of the park, as you probably know, is in the state of Wyoming. About 97% of the park is in Wyoming, about 2% is in Montana, and 1% is in the state of Idaho. The towns of Cook City and Silvergate are in Montana, so they then have to drive through Wyoming. But when you get to Mammoth Hot Springs, you're really only about, 3-4 miles odd to the south of Gardner, which is in Montana. And the road between Mammoth Hot Springs and Gardner crosses from Wyoming into Montana, which was a long way around of getting back to what I was about to say on Lewis Lake. I don't know if you can see in the distance, there's a boat there, somebody fishing. Where I was going with all that is the road between Old Faithful and West Thumb is one of the higher roads in Yellowstone National Park. It goes up over what's called Craig Pass, and while it's climbing up and over Craig Pass, it crosses over the Continental Divide twice, and I'll talk more about the Continental Divide in a moment, because we're going to be crossing the Continental Divide on this road as well. Because it's such a high road, you get a lot of snow on that road, so it's one of the last roads, as I mentioned, in Yellowstone to open. Dunraven Pass, which climbs up and over Mount Washburn between Grand Canyon over the Yellowstone and basically Tower Falls, that is the highest road that people travel over within Yellowstone National Park, and that generally only opens at the end of May, though for 2020 and 2021 it's closed all year because of road construction. So Craig Pass gets up fairly high, and that road is open fairly late. But when you are able finally to get down here after the road has opened up, it's beautiful to come to Lewis Lake, because you'll see ice on the lake, and a lot of ice still in the early spring. It's pretty much like Yellowstone Lake in that regard, which is covered by ice, almost the entire lake, up to 3 feet thick. The only places where Yellowstone Lake is not covered in ice is when there are thermal features, generally in the shallow areas, and the heat from the thermal features stops the ice from forming. We've now left Lewis Lake behind us, and if you look once again at the park map that I mentioned to you, at the road running up from the south entrance towards West Thumb, you'll notice that the Caldera line, that soft purple line that more or less follows Yellowstone's lower loop, the Caldera line cuts across the south end of Yellowstone Lake. The south end of Lewis Lake. So we are now within the Caldera area, and I believe I mentioned before that a caldera is a massive hole in the ground. It was created when the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted about 625,000 years ago. So you're probably asking yourself, well, if there's a massive hole in the ground, why are we going uphill? Where is the hole? And that's a good question, but bear in mind that the supervolcano last erupted, as I said, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So over that passage of time, the gigantic hole in the ground has been filled in, and it's really difficult, unless you're a scientist, to know where it is. There's a point where you can go up Dunraven Pass, which I mentioned a moment ago. You climb up from Canyon Village at Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone and start climbing up over Dunraven Pass, and you'll see a little pull out to the right, and there's one of those boards like the one I showed you at Lewis Canyon, and if you get out and you take a look, it says that is where the eastern edge of the caldera is. And I don't know how many times I've stood there and stared out at the eastern edge of the caldera, and I've never been able to notice it. But perhaps you'll have more luck than I. But remember that you won't be able to see it until 2022. We're continuing now north then, heading up towards the West Thumb area. West Thumb is of particular significance. I was talking about a caldera before, and we are now within the caldera area. West Thumb, scientists believe, is an area that was also created by a volcanic eruption. What happened was, by a volcanic, here we are coming to the Continental Divide, so I will get back to West Thumb in a minute. You may be able to see the sign says we're at almost 8,000 feet, 7,988 feet. The Continental Divide is an imaginary line running in a south-north or a north-south direction generally. I say generally because a little bit ahead of us on the road between West Thumb and Old Faithful, the divide actually runs east-west, but that's only for a relatively short area. And what the Continental Divide does is it separates the United States into two gigantic watersheds. Precipitation that falls on the west side of the divide theoretically is going to land up in the Pacific Ocean. So if it snows or rains on the west side of the divide, theoretically that will eventually make its way into the Pacific. One good example of looking at that, which I actually saw on Yellowstone National Park's website, there was a video by a park ranger, and she gave the example of consider a roof of a house, and water that falls on one side of the pitched roof will head off to whichever direction it is, the west or the east or the north or the south, and the water that falls on the other side, the rain that falls on the other side, will head off in the other direction. So you can think of the Continental Divide as being a gigantic pitched roof, and I mentioned that precipitation that falls on the west side is going to make its way into the Pacific Ocean, and then precipitation, the rain or the snow that falls on the east side of the divide, will head east towards the Atlantic Ocean. I mentioned that here in Yellowstone there's a section where the divide runs in an east-west rather than a north-south direction, and what that means is that precipitation that falls to the north will head up into the Atlantic Ocean, and precipitation that falls on the south goes to the Pacific Ocean, but that's just one of the curious things about Yellowstone. You can start to see Yellowstone Lake coming into view in the background, and this is Grant Village. Before I get off that though, right at the top of the divide between West Thumb and Old Faithful, the western of the two times that you pass it, Grant Village was named after President Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was the president who signed the proclamation that created Yellowstone as a national park, not only as America's first national park, but also as the world's first national park. So he's been commemorated with having Grant Village named after him. Many people think that it was Roosevelt who signed Yellowstone into being, but it was actually Grant. Roosevelt was a sport, and this is Theodore Roosevelt. He was a sportsman, he was a hunter, he was a fisherman, and he happened to be here in the Yellowstone area hunting and fishing at a time when an arch was being built up at Yellowstone's north entrance. And because he was here, just fortuitously, he was invited to come along and give a speech, and that's why the arch was named after him. But ironically, he never actually came back to Yellowstone after it was declared a national park. So I was talking about how at the top of the Continental Divide on the west side, the second of the two times that you pass it coming from where we are now, or the first time coming from Old Faithful, there's a beautiful lake. It's called Ice Lake. It's a really small lake, but it's one of the more unique lakes in the world because it flows in two directions. It flows into both the Atlantic Ocean and into the Indian Ocean, depending on where the precipitation falls. And guys, once again, I know I've left a lot of stories hanging up out there. If you do want answers to some of the stories that I haven't quite finished, please feel free to email us. You can see the address below. You can also tweet at us at Yellowstone Holes. That's Yellowstone Holes, or just ask questions in the comments section below. Thank you so much for joining me on another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. If you enjoy our Yellowstone tour series, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Otherwise, I hope to see you in Yellowstone one day.